something about this case continues to bother people across the country. Not just because Nancy Guthrie disappeared under disturbing circumstances. Not just because more than 100 days have passed without the answers many people expected. What continues to draw attention is the growing debate surrounding the scene itself. At first, the evidence appeared straightforward. An elderly woman reportedly vanished from her own home during the night. Investigators identified signs of a struggle. Blood evidence was found. Surveillance footage captured a masked individual moving around the property. For many observers, that seemed to tell a clear story. But as time passed and details remained limited, a different question began to emerge. What if some part of the scene was intentionally designed to create a certain impression? What if investigators were looking at more than a simple abduction scene? And perhaps most importantly, what evidence would suggest that possibility in the first place? That question has fueled countless discussions online. Some people believe the scene was exactly what it appeared to be. Others wonder whether certain details were manipulated to influence how investigators interpreted what happened that night. Today, we are going to examine that debate carefully. Not to promote rumors. Not to accuse anyone. But to understand why experienced investigators sometimes consider the possibility that a crime scene may have been altered, staged, or manipulated after an incident occurs. Because when emotions run high, assumptions often fill the gaps left by missing information. And in a case like this, there are still many gaps. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance quickly became national news. Public reports described a troubling sequence of events involving a late-night intrusion, physical evidence found outside the residence, and surveillance footage that captured activity near the home. The victim herself drew immediate concern. Nancy was an elderly woman. By all accounts, she should have been safe inside her own residence. When a vulnerable person disappears under those circumstances, investigators respond aggressively. The public does as well. As news coverage expanded, people began examining every available detail. The front porch. The surveillance footage. The blood evidence. The timeline. The reported communications that followed. Every element became part of a larger effort to understand what happened. And that is where the conversation about staging first began. Now, before we go any further, it is important to understand something that many people misunderstand about staged crime scenes. A staged scene does not automatically mean a crime never happened. In fact, many staged scenes involve very real crimes. Real victims. Real violence. Real evidence. The staging occurs afterward. Sometimes offenders move objects. Sometimes they alter the appearance of a location. Sometimes they attempt to redirect investigators toward a false narrative. The goal can vary. It may be to hide a motive. It may be to conceal a relationship between the victim and offender. It may be to delay an investigation. Or it may simply be an attempt to create confusion. Investigators have encountered all of those situations before. That alone would be unusual enough. But in the Nancy Guthrie case, much of the public discussion centers around one specific area of the property. The front porch. The surveillance footage reportedly captured a masked individual moving around the residence. Viewers have watched that footage repeatedly. Some people focus on the suspect's movements. Others focus on timing. Others pay attention to what appears to be an effort to obstruct the camera's view. That particular detail has generated significant discussion. According to public reports, foliage was allegedly placed in a way that interfered with surveillance coverage. For many viewers, that immediately raised questions. Why take the time to block a camera? Why remain visible at all? Why not simply avoid the camera completely? Those questions do not automatically point toward staging. But they do create uncertainty. And uncertainty is where investigations become complicated. Because behavior can be interpreted in multiple ways. One possibility is that the individual understood the camera's location and attempted to reduce visibility. That would not be unusual. Many offenders try to limit surveillance exposure. But investigators also understand that criminal behavior is not always logical. Sometimes offenders act impulsively. Sometimes they panic. Sometimes they make decisions that appear sophisticated but are actually driven by fear. Which raises another question. What was the person on that porch trying to accomplish? Was the goal concealment? Distraction? Or something else entirely? Investigators would likely examine those possibilities through behavioral analysis rather than assumptions. They would look at movement patterns, timing, decision-making, and consistency. Because people often reveal more through behavior than through words. Now let's move into another area that continues generating debate. The blood evidence. Whenever blood is discovered at a crime scene, public interest increases dramatically. People naturally associate blood with violence. And in many cases, that connection is justified. But experienced investigators know that blood evidence is often more complicated than it appears. A photograph can tell part of a story. It rarely tells the entire story. Some online discussions have focused on the amount of blood reportedly visible. Others have questioned its location. Some have speculated about whether the evidence appeared consistent with the events being described publicly. Those are understandable questions. However, there is an important limitation. Most people discussing the evidence have never examined it directly. They are working from photographs, screenshots, media reports, and second-hand descriptions. Investigators do not have that limitation. They examine the actual evidence. They analyze DNA. They study blood patterns. They evaluate transfer marks. They review laboratory findings. And those findings often reveal details that are impossible to determine from a photograph alone. What do you think? Would you feel comfortable drawing conclusions from a single image? Or would you want to know what forensic testing revealed first? That distinction matters. Because blood evidence can sometimes appear suspicious while ultimately supporting a completely ordinary explanation. And the opposite can also happen. Evidence that appears insignificant can become a major investigative breakthrough. Which is why investigators typically avoid making assumptions too early. Now, another factor that deserves attention involves timing. Every crime scene exists within a timeline. Evidence does not simply appear. It develops. Conditions change. Environmental factors influence what investigators observe. Temperature matters. Humidity matters. Surface materials matter. Time itself matters. Blood can change appearance over time. Objects can shift. Weather can affect evidence. All of those variables influence how investigators interpret a scene. And this is where public discussions sometimes become problematic. People often mistake possibility for certainty. They see one detail and build an entire theory around it. But real investigations rarely work that way. Investigators look for patterns. Not isolated observations. And that brings us to another major area of discussion. The timeline itself. For many people following this case, the timeline remains one of the most confusing aspects of the investigation. Questions continue surrounding movements, reported activities, and the sequence of events. Some viewers have expressed doubts about whether certain timelines make sense. Others believe there may be explanations that have not yet been released publicly. And that is entirely possible. Because investigators often possess information that remains confidential during active investigations. Modern cases rely heavily on digital evidence. Phone records. Location data. Application activity. Security cameras. Vehicle information. Electronic timestamps. These sources often provide far more accurate information than human memory. People forget things. Technology usually does not. According to investigators in many modern cases, digital evidence frequently becomes one of the most important tools available. A phone may reveal movement. A device may reveal activity. A timestamp may establish a sequence of events. And sometimes those records confirm witness statements. Other times they challenge them. Does that timeline make sense to you? Or do you think there may still be important pieces missing from the public record? That question continues driving discussion around this case. Because many observers feel there are details investigators know that the public does not. And honestly, that may be true. Investigations often operate that way. Authorities frequently withhold information for strategic reasons. Sometimes they protect witnesses. Sometimes they preserve evidence. Sometimes they monitor individuals connected to a case. And sometimes they simply want to prevent false confessions or misinformation. Now let's consider one final question before we close. Why does the idea of staging continue attracting so much attention? Part of the answer may be psychological. People naturally search for explanations when information is limited. The fewer answers available, the more theories emerge. That is true in nearly every high-profile investigation. The Nancy Guthrie case is no exception. A missing victim. Limited public updates. Unusual surveillance footage. Physical evidence. Digital questions. All of those factors create an environment where speculation grows rapidly. But investigators cannot operate on speculation. They must operate on evidence. That difference is important. Because while theories may change daily, evidence tends to remain far more reliable. And somewhere within that evidence lies the answer investigators are searching for. Whether the scene was exactly what it appeared to be. Whether certain elements were manipulated. Or whether public assumptions have simply moved too far ahead of the facts. Those answers will ultimately come from forensic findings, investigative work, and verified evidence. Not internet discussions. Not assumptions. Not rumors. As we continue following this case, one question remains at the center of everything. Was the scene truly telling investigators exactly what happened that night? Or was it telling only part of the story? I would like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the evidence points toward a straightforward crime scene? Or do you think investigators may be examining the possibility that certain details were intentionally altered? Share your perspective in the comments below. If you found this analysis informative, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss future updates. Most importantly, keep Nancy Guthrie and her loved ones in your thoughts. Because beyond every theory, every timeline, and every piece of evidence is a real person whose family is still searching for answers. And until those answers arrive, the pursuit of truth remains the most important part of this story.